Alright. Hello everybody, I'm Ben. Welcome to another episode of Creepshow. Today we're covering more of these tragic, horrible events that we usually cover here, so if you're into that, then you should probably follow. The series and all the content therein are available as both podcasts and YouTube videos, so depending on where you're watching, you can find them on YouTube, Spotify, Anchor, Reason, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch of other places. Without anything further else to add to that, let's get into the video, shall we? So, as you may remember, in the last big episode, the episode about Oki Al-Kite, we mentioned a serial killer called Israel Keys very briefly. I decided to make this episode about him so we can take a deeper look into a case about one of the possible candidates that may have taken the Robert Cooper persona. So this one is pretty rough, so, viewer discretion and such. On the morning of February 2nd, 2012, a young man arrived to work in Anchorage, Alaska. He worked at a popular coffee shop in the area known as the Common Grounds, and the building was a bright teal shack. The shop was situated inside this shack, and it was this morning that the barista arrived to work, walked to the employee entrance, and got ready to unlock it. But once he turned the key in the door, he realized it was already unlocked. Of course, being co-workers, he knew the girl who worked the night before, and it would have been her responsibility to lock up. But he figured that everyone makes mistakes from time to time, even if she had seemed capable and responsible so far in the past month that she had held the job there. The girl's name was Samantha Koenig, and she is the person we're telling this story of today. So after noting this and shrugging it off for the most part, her coworker walked into the shop and almost immediately realized that it looked as if Samantha had walked off during her shift. There were still cups out, napkins sitting on counters, and just a general sense that she hadn't done any of the cleaning needed to close the shop. So now he was thinking of scenarios that would have made Samantha so sloppy in doing her job, and as he was thinking of these, he was getting ready to unlock the register. Reaching down, putting the key in the drawer, and turning it before realizing this was unlocked too. He opened the drawer and found that there was quite a lot of cash missing from it, and this is when he realized they had been robbed. So he called his boss. Back to the night before, Samantha had asked her boyfriend Dwayne for a ride home after her shift. Dwayne arrived in front of the shop around 8:30 p.m., which would be about half an hour after her shift should have been over. Dwayne's job had kept him just a tiny bit longer than he expected, which made him late. So once he arrived, he looked around the parking lot for a bit for Samantha, before walking up to the darkened store in the frigid Alaska night. He then would press his face up to the glass and see that nobody was inside, appearing that the shop had been thoroughly closed up for the night. Dwayne immediately thought back to an argument he and Samantha had earlier the same night via text message. The fight consisted of her accusing him of cheating on her, which he replied to in quite the nonchalant way, seeming to not really care. This led to quite an ugly fight, so he walked back to his truck thinking maybe Samantha had gotten a ride home from one of her friends or her father to avoid seeing him afterwards. Once back inside his truck, he'd send Samantha a text asking if she was okay and made it home safely. After a few minutes, he received no reply and, rightfully worried, he'd head to her house to make sure she was safe. A few minutes later, he'd arrive at her house, knock on the door, and be answered by her single father, James. Once he was there, Dwayne would explain that he hadn't seen Samantha after her shift and wanted to make sure she made it home safely. But James would reply that he hadn't seen nor heard from Samantha yet either. Now thoroughly confused, both men go into the kitchen and start texting and calling Samantha, trying to get a hold of her by any means that they could manage, and after a few minutes of this, Dwayne's phone finally received a reply. The message from Samantha pretty clearly stated that she was still extremely upset with him and that she needed time to think. So she said she was going to stay with some of her friends for a few days. In the message, she also noted that, or she rather asked Dwayne to let Samantha's father know where she was. So Dwayne showed her father the text message, which immediately confused him. He said it was very uncharacteristic of her because he had raised her since she was 2 years old, and the two were very close. They usually didn't keep things from each other. And it would be more likely that she would have contacted him herself to let him know where she would be, as well as not making sense that she would ignore all the texts and phone calls, which showed that he was very clearly worried about her. The two men stayed up very late that night, trying to get more information from her, but she never responded to any of the texts they had sent afterwards. So, the following morning, once they had verified that they never got any more replies from Samantha, James went to the Anchorage police station and filed a missing persons report for his daughter. After receiving the report, an officer called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. The owner would reply that they had just gotten off the phone with the barista working that morning and informed them that there had apparently been a robbery, and nobody could get in touch with Samantha, and nobody seemed to know where she was. The owner also told the police officer that once she got the security footage from the night before, she would send it straight over to them to investigate. Now, while waiting on the footage, some officers would work on calling Samantha's friends and other family to see if they had any information on her whereabouts, none of which had any knowledge at all about where she was. A couple of officers also went to the Common Grounds later to search for themselves, and when they got there, there was no sign of a struggle outside or inside the building, and under the countertop there was a panic button that hadn't been pressed. So, even though James thought Samantha's last text message was odd, the officers began working under the idea that Samantha was the one who robbed the shop and left on her own accord. Something they didn't decide yet was how she would have left. It was a horribly cold night, there was snow, it was pretty generally miserable outside, and Anchorage isn't a very walkable destination from what I can tell. So she would have had some other kind of transportation for it to work. So, if Samantha was telling the truth and taking some time away to be with her friends at their place or places, then why didn't any of her friends know where she had went? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop released the security footage to the police. The footage had no audio, but it starts around 8 p.m. on February 1st, 2012. Which is of course the night Samantha went missing. The footage shows Samantha working inside the kiosk alone. She seems happy and working business as usual, seeming rather busy. At some point, someone outside of the range of the camera comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha, of course, acknowledges them, turns her head, and begins making the drink that was ordered. Once she finished making the drink, she turned to the window to give it to the person outside, but immediately steps back and lifts her arms up. Moments later, seemingly after orders from the person outside the window, she turns off the light and gets on her knees with her back facing towards the window. She stays like this for around a minute, not saying a word from what we can tell, before she slowly stands up, walks over to the register, and takes out the money. Before bringing it to the window and giving it to the person outside, and then she turns, kneels with her back towards the window once again, and a couple more minutes pass. The person outside leans their entire upper body into the window, reaches down and ties her hands together. And because of the fact that the lights were turned off, the security footage is horrible quality. It's all grainy and there's no way to identify who this person was. The details they came up with from this footage were that the offender was a male, wearing a big sweatshirt and a hat pulled low over his face. After he tied her hands, he would leap through the window, close it behind him, and stand Samantha up, before pressing a gun to her back and marching her out of the employee door, across the parking lot, and into a white pickup truck before the two drove away. For the following few days, the police, and now the FBI, which had been called in to participate in the investigation, ran into dead end after dead end, due to the lack of any helpful evidence. The only viable source they had was surveillance footage that was too grainy and low quality to helpfully tell who it was. Meanwhile, Samantha's father had rallied the support of nearly everyone in Anchorage to help organize efforts to look for her, as well as donating money, participating in searches. The efforts reached such a high point that major news outlets across the country noticed, and Samantha's case was widespread before much time had passed, leading to many who had no prior involvement with James or Samantha to donate thousands of dollars to help fund a reward for anyone who had any information about her whereabouts. However, despite the reward gaining thousands almost every single day, nobody had any idea what had become of her. They still hadn't gotten any more contact since the last text she had sent. And then, 3 weeks later, on February 24th, nobody had heard from Samantha since the last text she sent. However, today, Dwayne got a text message from Samantha's phone. The message was a note leading him to a particular bulletin board sign in a nearby public park. Naturally, Dwayne and James read this text, shared it with the police department, and then raced to the park, beating the police there by around 15 minutes. They walk into the park and make it to the bulletin board, and once there they find a Ziploc bag tacked onto it. Inside the bag was a ransom note, and on the ransom note, Xeroxed over it, was a photo of Samantha. In the picture, Samantha looks rather dazed. She's got a blank expression, and she's not looking directly at the camera. Also in the picture is the man holding a copy of the Anchorage Daily News dated February 13, 2012. This was her proof of life photo for the ransom. The captor was holding up the newspaper to indicate that she was still alive so he could collect ransom money. Now, this wasn't a good situation by any means, but it did give people involved hope that Samantha would be able to get out of this situation alive. As a week earlier, she was supposedly still alive. The demands of this ransom note were as followed. They were told to deposit $30,000 into Samantha's account immediately, and if that was met, she would be released 6 months after the full ransom was received. Following the advisement of the FBI, James deposited a portion of the ransom money into the account. What followed was the FBI waiting and watching the account because they knew if anyone tried to withdraw the money, they could track where the card was and by extension, hopefully find Samantha or at least her kidnapper. A few days passed before 3 separate withdrawals were made within Anchorage, but every time they got a notification for the withdrawals, the FBI would arrive on scene to find nobody there. They even tried to pull security footage from the ATMs to help, but the man making the withdrawals was wearing a ski mask and big sunglasses, making identification pretty much impossible from the footage. After these withdrawals, there was no more activity in the account for a week, and similarly in that time, there was no further word from Samantha. Then, once it was March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but they were in Arizona, then New Mexico, and then Texas. Just like before, FBI authorities would get there just short of finding the masked man. However, there was a break for the better this time. In one of the surveillance footage tapes from a Texas ATM, they had spotted the car the man was using. The car in question, a white Ford Focus, was soon reported to authorities and they were advised to look out for cars matching the description, especially if they were heading east on a specific Texas highway. On March 13th, a patrol officer in Texas would spot a car matching the description in a hotel parking lot. He would wait until a man in his 30s walked down from his hotel room and left the premises, following the car and looking for literally any reason to pull him over so he could investigate further without drawing too much attention and letting the culprit get away again. Eventually, on this drive, he would realize, thanks to his radar gun, that this man was going 2 miles over the speed limit, giving him his opening to pull him over. So, he got out of his car, walked up to the driver's side window and spoke to the man, who was reportedly very calm. And, as per usual protocol, the patrol officer asked for his license. The man handed over an Alaskan driver's license belonging to a man named Israel Keys from Anchorage. Almost immediately, the patrolman knew this was the guy they had been looking for the whole time. He called for backup, and before long, he and the other officers were searching Keys' car. In the trunk, they found a ski mask, some other clothes that matched those in the surveillance videos, and a gun. They also found Samantha's phone and debit card. Now, after he was brought into custody, Keys denied having any sort of involvement with Samantha's disappearance. Once he was presented with the evidence against him, however, he caved and said he'd confess to what happened to her if they were to provide him with a few items. These items were an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers, and a cigar. Once he got these, he finally spoke, and what he said was so incredibly detailed and disturbing that the FBI hasn't made the entire transcript of his confession public. We do, however, have the version of events that was made public, and I will be covering those shortly. However, if you're squeamish about this kind of stuff, this might be where you want to click off. Back to February 1st, 2012. Keys decided he was going to rob the Common Grounds coffee shop. He walked up to the window, fully expecting just some teenager to be working inside, and of course he was right. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was manning the shop. He ordered an Americano coffee, and while she turned to make his drink, his plans changed. He seemingly no longer content to just rob the money, he was going to rob the store of Samantha as well. Once she gave him his coffee, he discreetly pulled a gun on her and informed her that this was a robbery. This is when she backed away and put up her hands before turning around, had her hands tied, and before he jumped inside. He said that once he was inside the shop, he took some napkins and pressed them into her mouth so she couldn't make any cries for help. Then he marched her out the door, took her to his car, put her inside, and drove off. Once inside the vehicle, he took the napkins from her mouth and told her that if she tried to escape or tried to flag anyone down, that he'd kill her right then and there. He seemed to take some sort of pleasure in noting her terrified obedience, as it was mentioned quite a few times during his confession. Personally, it makes me uncomfortable to keep repeating that sentence, so I will skip over it whenever it comes back up unless it's important. He noted that she was trying her best to stay composed during the ordeal, and at some point during the drive, Keyes reached over, took Samantha's phone, and sent the text to Dwayne that said she was going to be spending a few days with her friends and that he should tell her father where she was. Then, Keyes told Samantha he was going to be holding her hostage to try and extract ransom money from her father. She tried to tell him that her family was very poor and wouldn't have the money for it, but he told her that he knew they would raise the money somehow. After this, they would drive around Anchorage for several hours, periodically stopping so Samantha could go to the bathroom or so Keyes could smoke a cigar. Around midnight, Keyes made his way back to his house, pulled into the driveway, and told Samantha to go in the back seat and lie down. He then put tarps over her and then reminded her yet again that if she tried to escape, he would kill her. After that, he got out of the vehicle, walked into his house, and made sure his girlfriend and 10-year-old daughter were asleep. In just a few hours, Keyes and his daughter were scheduled to go for a 2-week-long luxury cruise in New Orleans. Once he verified they were asleep, he left his house, went back to the vehicle, and blindfolded Samantha before bringing her to his shed. Once inside, he sat her down on an upside-down bucket before putting a rope around her neck and anchoring both ends of the rope into the wall to keep her still. Keyes turned his radio all the way up to mask any noise she might make while in the shed, even though he kept repeating to her that he'd kill her if she made any noise. After that, he gave her a couple of cigarettes to smoke and told her that she'd be just fine. He was going to get the ransom, and then she'd be on her way out. He turned on some heaters in the shed to keep it warm, and then he left, locked the door, and went back inside to check if his girlfriend and daughter were still asleep, which they were. After that, he drank some wine and relaxed, and then he would grab a cup of water, walk back out to the shed, and give Samantha the cup. This is yet another part where he said she was composed and scared and obedient, but I figured I might as well repeat it here because it's about to get pretty twisted at this point anyways. She asked him after that if he had spoken to her father about the ransom and if he had the situation set up yet. He's told her yes, and that he had spoken to her father about all the details, that everything was working out smoothly. He told her that they were already raising the money to get her out, and everything was going exactly to plan. After that, he walked up to her and unscrewed the 2 anchors in the wall that held the rope tight against her neck. He cut the zip ties holding her wrists together and allowed her to finally relax. Sit forward and have a moment of ease. He stated that it was exceedingly obvious that Samantha was relieved. She was told she was going to be safe, she was unbound, and eventually she'd be out of this situation. But Keyes had other plans. A few moments after this, he grabbed her more aggressively than before and tied her up all over again. This time in much more thorough ways, and restricted her movement even more. He later said that he only cut her ties and unbound her to see what she would do if she thought she was going to be let go. When in reality, this whole time, he never even planned to let her go. He got no ransom agreement. He never spoke to her father. Keyes told investigators that while he tied her up the second time, he looked her in the face. And as sickening as it is to repeat something like this again, she had a look of total resignation. She had realized what he actually had in store for her, and now she had lost even the faintest glimmer of hope that she had left. After she was restrained again, Keyes left the shed, locked it behind him, and checked once again to make sure his girlfriend and daughter were asleep for a final time. Once he verified that they were, he went back to the shed, opened the lock, went inside, and now, faced with the absolutely terrified Samantha, he walked up to her and began to assault her in various ways. Once he was done, and Keyes loomed over her, she managed to ask him if he was going to kill her, to which he replied, "Yes, I am." He then put on some leather gloves as Samantha tried to talk him out of it, bargaining for her own life. It was then that he told her there was absolutely no other way. During his interview, Keyes would tell investigators that she impressed him with her bravery. Now, at near 4 a.m., Keyes took a knife, plunged it into Samantha's back, and choked her until she stopped moving. On a related note, yet again making that remark about her obedience, he noted that she never made a sound through the whole ordeal. After she was dead, Keyes left the shed, locked the door, went inside, took a shower, and told his daughter to start getting ready for their trip because it was about to be time to go. Then he went back into the shed, turned off and put away the space heaters, and wrapped Samantha's body in some tarps before pushing it to the back of the shed. He turned off his radio and locked the shed with both the lock and a padlock before going back inside and making his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., the cab showed up at the house, and Keyes and his daughter departed to the airport. Then they went to New Orleans, where they took their 2-week-long vacation. After he got back, he went to the shed and unrolled the tarp, and whenever he decided that Samantha was looking lively enough, he dressed her in new clothes, covered her face in makeup, and braided her hair, before stitching her eyelids open so that it would give the impression that she was alive and mostly alert. Then he held up the newspaper we mentioned earlier from the proof of life photo and shot the picture. If you wish to see the picture, it is on Google, but this is at your own discretion if you want to see something like that. It's pretty horrible knowing the context. After these photos were taken, he chopped up her body and disposed of it in a frozen lake nearby. And as it turns out, Samantha was far from Israel Keyes' first victim. As I mentioned before, and in the previous episode, he was a rather prolific serial killer. What I have yet to mention, in this episode at least, is that despite his huge amount of traveling to make these randomly chosen murders, he also had murder caches stashed throughout the country. Whenever he had the urge to kill, he'd just travel, dig up his murder kit, and get to work. I mentioned his disguises and such in my previous episode too. Those were probably in the kits as well. The unpredictable nature that Keyes exhibited in his killings meant that it didn't matter if his targets were big or small, rich or poor, male or female. The only rule he had was that he swore off killing children when his daughter was born. He simply enjoyed watching people suffer and die at his hands, it seemed. Keyes even told investigators that as soon as he saw Samantha, he knew he wanted to kill her. Everything about the robbery and the ransom was just a lie to keep her in line while he played his twisted game. He confessed to killing Samantha as well as an older couple in Vermont called Bill and Lorraine Courier. They too were chosen at random and abducted from their home in Essex, Vermont on June 8, 2011. They were taken to a farmhouse and murdered, but the rest of his killings were left mostly unsolved, as Keyes supposedly, though there is some disagreement, rightfully so on this claim, killed himself in police custody December of 2012, before he was fully naming his other victims, leaving behind 11 skulls and a pentagram made in his own blood in his cell. A bit more about his suicide. It was rather botched, hence why people and I say it's a supposed suicide, because someone who derives pleasure from and has killed at least a good handful of people would most likely know how to do something like that without a hitch. I mean, even people who have never killed anyone can manage it, so why would he not be able to? He was, in fact, confessing several killings to the FBI. Some of his interrogation tapes are online and you could watch them if you'd really like. He was bargaining for the information about his supposed 11 other killings because he wanted, in exchange for that, a execution date. He did get an execution date, I believe, but some people say that he may have been killed to keep him quiet. This being said, if you're having any sort of self-harming thoughts, I highly recommend not acting on them, and instead talking to someone who may help. I can't do much about video descriptions and stuff, but the suicide hotline number will be in the descriptions of my videos from this point onwards if you ever need it. So, what do you think? Does Israel Keyes strike you as similar to Robert Cooper in my previous long episode? Leave a comment or message me somewhere. Let me know your thoughts and analysis and other stuff like that, or maybe you'd like to suggest a case that you'd like to see me research. Drop me a line and get involved. I've been Ben, and this has been yet another chilling episode of Creepshow. Thank you for watching.